Imagine going camping with your girlfriend and friends, only for them to all be brutally stabbed to death through the tent as they slept. You nearly die yourself after having been stabbed numerous times as well. But you see your attacker, who looks super creepy with glaring red eyes. You somehow survive this horrific tragedy, only to be falsely accused of the crime decades later. The real killer was never found, yet someone who looked identical to him showed up to your friend's funeral. This is the disturbing case of the Lake Bodom murders. The details surrounding this crime and the description of the killer is something straight out of a horror movie. This case is still unsolved, and whoever killed these 3 teenagers could still be out there. So let's talk about it. The story begins on June 4th, 1960. 15-year-old Mila Yorkland and Anya Maki were best friends. Mila was dating 18-year-old Niels Gustafsson, and Anya was dating Seppo Bolsman, who was also 18. They were your typical happy friend group who were always down to have some fun together. So that day, the group decided to go camping on the shore of Lake Bodom in Finland. The night started out great. They set up their tent that they would all be later sharing and continued to joke and have fun together. But by the next morning, 3 of them would be dead. Sometime between the hours of 4 and 6 a.m., someone attacked the group as they slept. They walked up, cut the strings that held their tent up, and began stabbing all 4 of the teenagers. This killer viciously stabbed them all multiple times through the fabric as they all tried to escape. But sadly, they never stood a chance. At around 6 a.m., a group of boys who were birdwatching near the lake saw their tent collapse and a blonde man walk away from the campsite. But nobody would know what actually took place there for another few hours. At 11 a.m., a carpenter in the area stumbled across the campsite, only to discover a horrific scene. 3 of the teenagers were dead, with Niels barely hanging on by a thread. Police were quickly called, but to everyone's horror, the scene was much more gruesome than anyone could have imagined. So Mila, Anya, and Seppo were all deceased, having been stabbed multiple times by a really sharp knife. They were also savagely attacked and suffered severe head trauma, likely from a rock. Niels' girlfriend Mila suffered the most gruesome injuries out of everyone. She was found lying on top of the tent, naked from the waist down, and she had been stabbed multiple times after she was very clearly dead. Her skull had also been shattered. Niels was found outside the tent with broken facial bones, a severe concussion, and multiple stab wounds as well. But he was somehow still alive, barely hanging on. The sheer brutality of this crime left many wondering if it was targeted or if it was just some random attack. Once Niels came to, he told authorities that he saw a glimpse of the killer, who was wearing all black and had bright red eyes glaring at him. This was a really eerie crime scene because nothing about it made sense. On top of blood just being everywhere, the killer took random items from the scene, like some of the victims' wallets and the keys to their motorcycles, which was weird because they didn't actually take the motorcycles themselves. Those were left behind. Some of the victims' clothes were missing as well, including Niels' shoes. But oddly enough, some of the items were found partially hidden less than a mile away from the murder site just up the beach. Police were able to conclude that the killer definitely started attacking them from outside the tent, never actually injuring them from the inside, which is crazy. The murder weapon, which was obviously a knife and likely a large rock, have never been found. No other DNA or any other evidence from the killer was left behind. It was like he just showed up, committed this brutal crime, and then vanished into thin air. Right from the get-go though, police kind of botched this investigation. They didn't secure the scene at all, so the crime scene was invaded by local residents, journalists, and other nosy campers trying to see what was going on. So any potential evidence was either lost or destroyed. This didn't stop them from trying to figure out who did this though, and as time went on, a funeral for the 3 victims was held. People tried to move on, but it was hard, not knowing if the killer would strike again. Once Niels was all healed up, he underwent hypnosis to try and give authorities a description of the killer that he saw that morning. And from that, this composite sketch was made of the man responsible for butchering 3 teenagers as they slept. This is honestly one of the most disturbing police sketches I have ever seen, and I just cannot imagine waking up to this man attacking me and my friends. This composite sketch was pushed out to the public to try and find whoever did this, but this is when the story takes a disturbing turn. So this sketch alone is horrifying, but then this photo from the victims' funerals began to resurface. It seems innocent enough until you see the man who looks identical to the composite sketch in attendance. Since the sketch was released well after the funeral, no one knew it at the time, but the man who killed these 3 kids was right there, watching. You'd think with how creepy and distinct this man looks that he would quickly be found, but that was not the case. The Lake Bodom killer was never caught, and to this day, the murders remain unsolved. Over the years though, there have been many theories and possible suspects. The first suspect was a local man named Vladimir Gilstrom. Vladimir lived nearby and was known to be super violent and hostile towards campers. He had previously cut down people's tents before and threw rocks at anyone who walked down his street, which was right next to Lake Bodom. Vladimir later confessed to the murder murders while drunk one night before drowning himself in the very same lake in 1969. The boys who were birdwatching the morning of the Lake Bodom murders later claimed that Valdemar was the blonde man that they had seen walking away from the crime scene, but police found no physical evidence tying him to the crime, so he was never charged. The second suspect was a German man named Hans Osman. A lot of people suspect Hans was the killer simply because he looks a lot like the Composite sketch. He also lived right up the road from Lake Bodom and the crime scene. He was known to abuse his wife, and he claimed his alibi was that he was with her that entire day of the murders, which his wife backed up, probably because she was scared of him and didn't want to be his next victim. But what's really creepy is that very same morning that the bodies were discovered on Lake Bodom, Hans showed up to a nearby hospital with bloody clothes and dirt under his fingernails. Coincidence? You tell me. What also points to him being involved was that one of Neil's shoes was found hidden near Hans' house. Again though, police could never find any physical evidence tying him to the crime, so he too was never charged. Hans eventually moved to Sweden and died in the late 90s. He was a suspect in 5 other cases and even confessed to one of them on his deathbed, so it's a very real possibility that he also committed this crime. Suspect number 3 is a man named Pentti Swainanen, and I'm sorry if I am butchering that name. Pentti was a violent criminal who, a few years after the murders, confessed to a fellow inmate that he killed the kids on Lake Bodom. Pentti was known for falsely confessing to crimes he didn't commit in the past, and authorities don't think he's responsible because he would have been 14 years old at the time of the murders. It's not likely that he would have been able to single-handedly overpower 4 older teenagers, and no evidence was ever found connecting him to the crime either. And lastly, suspect number 4 came as a shock to everyone, for a few reasons really. The 4th suspect was Niels himself, the sole survivor of this massacre. He was out of the blue arrested in 2004, so 40 years after his friends were killed. Authorities were able to use new forensic analysis and thought that finally this case would be closed. According to them, based on bloodstain patterns, they believe that Niels was really drunk that night and was exiled from the tent, which sent him into a rage. They believe that Niels then got into a fight with Seppo, which is how he got all of those broken bones in his face, and then he proceeded to kill all of them. At the trial, Niels' lawyers argued that there's no way that he would have been able to kill all 3 of his friends like that given the extent of his own injuries. Not only had he been stabbed numerous times too, but he also had a major concussion, so it's nearly impossible that he would have been coherent enough to kill 3 other people with such force. Prosecutors, on the other hand, pointed out that the killer took and wore Niels' shoes, and then he committed the murders while wearing them before hiding them up the beach. When authorities found Niels that day, he was unconscious on top of the tent and barefoot. So using new modern DNA analysis, authorities found that the 3 murdered victims' blood was on Niels' shoes, but his wasn't at all. According to them, this proved that Niels' injuries occurred at a different time than when his friends were killed. So the only explanation in their eyes was that he killed his friends, faked the robbery, and took the stolen items, including his own shoes, and hid them a little ways up the beach. Then he stabbed himself numerous times before going back to the tent and pretending to be unconscious. They had virtually no evidence on Niels at all, but they used an incriminating comment that he made when he was arrested against him. Niels reportedly said, quote, "What's done is done. I'll get 15 years." End quote. So while that is weird, it doesn't necessarily mean he killed his friends. One thing they really honed in on was the fact that Niels' girlfriend had the worst injuries out of everyone. To them, it seemed like maybe Niels killed her out of a jealous rage or after a fight, and then he killed the rest of them after. But like I said, they had no concrete evidence against him. And in 2005, he was acquitted of all charges and found not guilty. The courts found no motive for such a heinous and brutal crime. And now knowing pretty much the exact timeline, it was virtually impossible for the killer to have been Niels. They awarded him what's equivalent to $8,000 and pretty much said sorry for this inconvenience, and that was that. He was then left to once again heal from the trauma of reliving the worst day of his life. What really gets me though is how random this whole attack was. They were just a bunch of kids having fun, living their lives, only to be killed in their most vulnerable state. And everyone that knows me knows that that is one of my biggest fears, being attacked while I'm sleeping. They stood no chance, and I can't believe that someone as creepy and distinct looking as this killer has never been caught. But it's now been 65 years, and whatever really happened to those kids on Lake Bodom that day, and who was responsible, remains a mystery.